What is happening here?
There's nothing left to say right now about that.
When fans first met Meri Brown on Sister Wives, they saw strength. They saw composure. They saw someone who carried herself with quiet resilience, even in the middle of a complex plural marriage. But what many didn't fully see, at least not at first, was the deeply personal struggle she was facing behind the scenes. A struggle that would shape not only her journey within the Brown family, but also her sense of identity, her relationships, and her emotional world. And that struggle was infertility. In a family built around the idea of growth, children, and expansion, fertility wasn't just a personal matter. It was central to the entire lifestyle. Each new child represented not just love, but purpose, connection, legacy. And for Meri, that created a unique kind of pressure. Because while other members of the family were welcoming more children, expanding their households, and building large families, her experience was very different. She had one child, and after that, things didn't go the way she had hoped. From the outside, it's easy to reduce infertility to numbers, to outcomes, to the simple idea of having or not having more children. But what Meri Brown has described, and what many viewers have come to understand, is that the hardest part isn't always the outcome. It's the emotional journey, the waiting, the uncertainty, a constant cycle of hope and disappointment. And in her case, that emotional weight was amplified by the environment she was in. Because she wasn't experiencing this in isolation, she was experiencing it within a plural family where children were being born around her, where growth was visible, where comparisons, whether spoken or unspoken, were impossible to avoid. For Kody Brown, the desire for a large family was always clear. He often spoke about wanting many children, about building something big, something lasting. And while that vision aligned with the family's overall structure, it created a complicated dynamic for Meri. Because when one partner's dream is centered around expansion, and another is facing limitations in that area, it can lead to emotional distance. Not intentionally, but gradually, subtly. Moments where expectations don't match reality, where support is there, but doesn't fully bridge the gap. One of the most difficult aspects of infertility is how invisible it can be. There are no obvious signs, no clear timelines, just internal struggles that are often hard to explain, even to those closest to you. And for Meri, this meant carrying a lot of that weight quietly, even while being part of a very public family on Sister Wives. Viewers saw glimpses of her pain over the years, conversations about trying again, discussions about possible options, moments where hope resurfaced, only to be followed by hesitation. Because infertility doesn't just affect the body, it affects the mind. It changes how you think about the future, how you define yourself, how you relate to others. For someone in Meri's position, it also raises difficult questions. What is my role in this family? Where do I fit when the thing that defines so much of this lifestyle, having children, is no longer something I can actively contribute to in the same way? Those questions don't always have clear answers, and over time, they can create a sense of isolation, even in a family full of people, even in a house full of activity. Then there's the emotional complexity of watching others experience what you deeply want. In the Brown family, that meant seeing other wives grow their families, celebrate pregnancies, raise young children. And while there can be joy in that, there can also be quiet pain, not because you don't feel happy for them, but because it reminds you of what you're missing. And that duality, joy and pain existing at the same time, is one of the hardest parts of the journey. For Meri Brown, this wasn't just a phase. It was something that unfolded over years, something that evolved as the family grew and changed, something that required constant emotional adjustment. And what makes her story so impactful is not just the struggle itself, but how she navigated it. How she continued to show up, to participate, to be part of the family, even when she may have felt disconnected from one of its core elements.
But as we begin to understand her experience more deeply, one thing becomes clear. The toughest part of fertility struggles isn't always the physical challenge. It's the emotional reality that comes with it. The silent battles, the unspoken fears, the moments of questioning, and the ongoing effort to find peace in a situation that doesn't have easy answers. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how these struggles began to impact Meri's relationship with Kody, and how differing expectations around family and children started to create emotional distance between them. Because sometimes, the most difficult part of a journey isn't what happens internally, it's how it changes the relationships around you. As Meri Brown continued navigating her fertility struggles, the emotional weight didn't stay confined to her alone. It slowly began to impact one of the most important relationships in her life, her marriage to Kody Brown. Because in a family like the one shown on Sister Wives, expectations around children aren't just personal, they're deeply connected to the structure of the relationship itself. From early on, Kody had made it clear that he envisioned a large, growing family. Children were not just a desire, they were a central part of his identity and purpose. And for a time, that vision aligned with Meri's own hopes. She wanted more children, she wanted to expand her family, she wanted to be part of that growth. But as time went on, and as her fertility challenges became more apparent, that alignment began to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, quietly. And that's what made it so difficult, because when expectations change slowly, it's harder to pinpoint the exact moment things start to feel different. At first there was hope, discussions about trying again, conversations about timing, possibilities that felt real enough to hold on to. But over time, those conversations became less frequent, less certain, more complicated, and eventually they began to carry a different tone, one that wasn't just about hope, but about acceptance. And that's where things started to become emotionally complex, because acceptance doesn't happen all at once. It's a process, one that involves grief, reflection, and adjustment. And not everyone moves through that process at the same pace. For Meri Brown, the journey was deeply personal. Her connection to the idea of having more children didn't just disappear. It lingered, it resurfaced, it created moments of what if that were hard to ignore. But for Kody Brown, the situation looked different. Because while Meri was processing the emotional side of the struggle, he was still able to expand his family through his other relationships, and that created a unique dynamic, one where the impact of infertility was not shared equally. Meri felt the limitation directly. Kody, while supportive, was still experiencing growth in other areas of his life, and that difference, subtle as it may seem, can create distance. Not because either person is doing something wrong, but because their experiences are no longer aligned. This is where one of the toughest parts of Meri's journey comes into focus, feeling alone in something that deeply affects a shared relationship. Because even when there is empathy, even when there is understanding, there's still a gap between what one person is going through and what the other is able to fully experience. And over time, that gap can grow. Communication becomes more difficult, not because there's nothing to say, but because it's hard to put certain feelings into words. How do you explain the emotional weight of something that is both deeply personal and constantly present? How do you express the kind of loss that isn't always visible to others? For Meri, these weren't just abstract questions, they were part of her daily reality. And as those feelings continued, they began to influence how she saw herself within the relationship, her role, her place, her connection. Because when one of the core foundations of a shared vision changes, everything else has to adjust. At the same time, there were external pressures. Being part of a public family on Sister Wives meant that personal struggles often became part of a larger narrative. Conversations about fertility, family planning, and relationships were not just private, they were discussed openly, analyzed, watched. And that kind of visibility can make an already difficult situation even harder, because it adds another layer of expectation, another level of awareness, another reminder that what you're going through isn't just yours, it's being observed. For Meri, this meant navigating her emotions not just within her relationship, but within a broader context where everything felt amplified. And yet, through all of this, she continued to show resilience. She stayed engaged. She participated in conversations. She tried to find clarity in a situation that didn't offer easy answers. But even with that strength, the impact on her relationship with Kody became more visible over time. Less connection, more distance, moments where the emotional gap felt harder to bridge. And while fertility struggles may have been the starting point, the effects extended far beyond that. Because when something changes at the core of a relationship, it doesn't stay isolated. It influences everything. As we move into the next part, we'll take a closer look at the options that were considered, IVF, surrogacy, and other possibilities, and why even those paths came with their own emotional challenges. Because sometimes, having options doesn't make a decision easier. It makes it more complicated.
As Meri Brown continued facing the emotional weight of infertility on Sister Wives, The conversation eventually shifted from, "Why is this happening?" to something even more difficult. What can we do about it? Because when natural options become uncertain, new possibilities begin to surface. Medical intervention, alternative paths, decisions that carry hope, but also pressure. For Meri and Kody Brown, this opened the door to conversations about fertility treatments, and one of the most talked about options was IVF, in vitro fertilization. On the surface, IVF can seem like a solution, a way to regain control, a chance to turn hope into reality. But in truth, it's not that simple. Because IVF isn't just a medical process, it's an emotional commitment, a financial investment, and a journey filled with uncertainty. For Meri, the idea of going through IVF brought up a mix of emotions. Hope, of course, but also fear. Because with every possibility comes the risk of disappointment. And when you've already experienced that cycle, hope followed by loss, the thought of repeating it can be overwhelming. There's also the physical aspect. Treatments, procedures, the toll on the body. All of it adds another layer to an already heavy decision. But beyond the medical side, there was something even more complex. Timing. By the time these conversations were happening, years had already passed. Life had moved forward. The family had grown in other ways. And the question wasn't just, can we do this? It was, should we? Because wanting something doesn't always mean it's the right decision at that moment in your life. And that realization can be incredibly difficult to accept. Then there was another option, one that added an entirely different emotional dimension. Surrogacy. At one point, Robin Brown even offered to be a surrogate for Meri, a gesture that on the surface seemed generous, supportive, an example of families stepping in to help one another. But for Meri, this wasn't a simple decision, because surrogacy isn't just about having a child, it's about how that child comes into the world. It's about control, connection, identity, and accepting a path that looks very different from what you originally imagined. For some, surrogacy can feel like a beautiful solution. For others, it can feel emotionally complicated. And for Meri, it was both. There's also the reality of what it means within a plural family. If Robin carried the child, how would that affect their dynamic? Would it strengthen their bond, or create new layers of complexity? These are not easy questions, and they don't have clear answers, because every choice comes with consequences, not just practical, but emotional. At the same time, there was the option of doing nothing, of accepting things as they were, of choosing to move forward without pursuing additional paths. But even that is a decision, and often it's the hardest one, because it requires letting go, not just of a plan, but of a possibility, a future that once felt real. For Meri Brown, this is where the true weight of the situation became clear. It wasn't just about choosing a path, it was about what each path represented. IVF meant hope, but also risk. Surrogacy meant possibility, but also complexity. Acceptance meant peace, but also loss. And no matter which direction she looked, there was no option that felt completely right. Only options that required sacrifice in different ways. Meanwhile, for Kody Brown, the decision process looked different. While he was part of the conversation, the emotional burden was not the same. Because ultimately, it was Meri's body, Meri's experience, Meri's journey. And that difference once again highlighted the emotional gap between them. Even when both people are involved, not all experiences are shared equally. This is what makes fertility decisions so complex. They're not just about outcomes. They're about identity, control, timing, emotional readiness, and the willingness to face uncertainty. For viewers of Sister Wives, these conversations offered a rare glimpse into something deeply personal, not dramatized, not simplified, but real, messy, unresolved. And that's what made it so powerful, because it showed that even with options, even with support, even with visibility, some decisions remain incredibly difficult, not because there's no answer, but because every answer comes with its own kind of pain. As we move into the next part, we'll explore the moment when Meri had to confront one of the hardest realities of all,
not just choosing between options, but facing the emotional impact of whichever choice she made. Because sometimes, the most difficult part of a journey isn't deciding what to do. It's living with that decision afterward. As the conversations around IVF, surrogacy, and other possibilities continued, Meri Brown found herself facing a moment that was far more difficult than simply choosing an option. It was the moment of realizing that no matter what she decided, something would be lost. On Sister Wives, viewers saw pieces of the struggle unfold, but what stood out most wasn't just the decision itself, it was the emotional weight behind it. Because when you're standing at a crossroads like this, it's not just about moving forward, it's about letting go. Letting go of a version of your life you once imagined. For years, Meri had held on to the idea of having more children. It wasn't just a plan, it was part of how she saw her future, part of how she saw herself. And now she was being asked, by circumstances, by time, by reality, to redefine that vision. That kind of shift isn't easy, because it forces you to confront questions that don't have simple answers. Questions like, who am I if this part of my life doesn't happen? What does my role look like moving forward? Where do I find purpose when something so central to my identity changes? These are not just practical concerns, they're deeply emotional. And for Meri Brown, they became impossible to ignore. At the same time, the pressure of making a final decision added another layer of complexity. Because final decisions carry permanence. They close doors. They remove the what if. And while that can bring clarity, it can also bring grief. Even if the decision is the right one, even if it's made with careful thought and understanding, there's still a sense of loss. A quiet acknowledgement that something you once hoped for is no longer part of your future. For Meri, this meant sitting with that reality, not just intellectually, but emotionally, allowing herself to feel the disappointment, the sadness, the uncertainty. And that process takes time. It's not something that happens overnight. It unfolds slowly, in moments, in reflections, in conversations that don't always lead to clear conclusions. Meanwhile, her relationship with Kody Brown continued to feel the effects of this journey, because even though the decision centered around her body and her experience, it was still part of their shared life. And when something so significant changes, it naturally affects how two people connect. There were moments where support was present, where understanding existed, but there were also moments where the emotional gap felt more noticeable, where it became clear that they were processing the situation in different ways, at different speeds. And that difference can create distance, not because of a lack of care, but because of a lack of shared experience. One of the most difficult parts of Meri's journey was that her grief didn't have a clear endpoint. There wasn't a single moment where everything was resolved. Instead, it came in waves. Moments where she felt strong and accepting, followed by moments where the loss felt fresh again. And that's something many people don't talk about when it comes to fertility struggles. The idea that even after a decision is made, the emotional journey continues. It doesn't just stop. It evolves. It becomes part of your story. Another layer to this experience was the environment she was in. Being part of a plural family meant that even as she processed her decision, life around her continued in a very different way. Children growing, families expanding, milestones being reached. And while those moments can bring joy, they can also serve as reminders, not intentionally, but naturally, reminders of the path that didn't unfold. For viewers of Sister Wives, this phase of Meri's journey was one of the most emotional, because it moved beyond discussion and into reality. It showed what it looks like to face a decision that doesn't have a perfect outcome, to choose a path not because it's ideal, but because it's the one that aligns with Elaine's wild in life. And that's something many people can relate to, because not every decision is about winning. Sometimes it's about finding peace, even when that peace comes with a sense of loss. For Meri Brown, this moment marked a turning point, not just in her fertility journey, but in how she began to see herself, her role, her future. Because once a decision like this is made, it creates space. Space to redefine, to rebuild, to explore new directions. But before that can happen, there's a necessary step: acceptance. And acceptance isn't about forgetting what you wanted. It's about acknowledging it, honoring it, and then allowing yourself to move forward. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how this decision began to reshape Meri's identity within the family, and how she started to redefine her purpose beyond the expectations that once defined her. Because sometimes, the end of one chapter is the beginning of discovering who you are without it.
After facing the emotional weight of her fertility journey, Meri Brown entered a phase that was just as challenging, but in a completely different way. She had to redefine who she was, not just as a wife, not just as part of the family on Sister Wives, but as an individual, because for years, a large part of her identity had been tied to the idea of expanding her family, of having more children, of participating in a lifestyle where motherhood played a central role. And when that path no longer existed in the way she had hoped, it created a space that needed to be filled with something new. But figuring out what that something new looks like isn't easy, because identity isn't something you can simply replace. It evolves. And that evolution often comes with uncertainty. For Meri, one of the biggest challenges was understanding her place within the family moving forward. In a plural family where children are a major focus, roles can sometimes feel clearly defined. Mothers raising young kids, households full of activity, constant growth and change. But when you're no longer in that phase, it can feel like you're standing on the outside looking in. Not excluded, but different. And that difference can be difficult to process. There's a question that quietly begins to form. Where do I fit now? For Meri Brown, that question didn't come with an immediate answer. Instead, it led to a period of reflection, of trying to understand what her role could be beyond the expectations that had once defined it. At the same time, the family itself was changing. Relationships were evolving, dynamics were shifting. And as those changes unfolded, Meri's journey became even more individual. Less about fitting into a collective structure, more about discovering her own path. This is where her strength began to show in a different way. Not just through endurance, but through independence. She started to focus on herself, her interests, her goals, her growth. And while that shift may seem natural from the outside, it's important to understand how significant it really is. Because choosing to focus on yourself after years of prioritizing a shared vision requires courage. It means stepping into the unknown, letting go of expectations, and trusting that you can create something meaningful on your own terms. For viewers of Sister Wives, this part of Meri's journey offered a different perspective, one that moved beyond the initial struggle and into something more reflective, more introspective. It showed what happens after the hardest decisions are made, after the emotional storm begins to settle, when you're left with the question, now what? For Meri, the answer didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, moments of clarity, small steps toward independence, a growing sense that her life didn't have to be defined by what didn't happen, that she could still create purpose, still build something meaningful, just in a different way. However, this transition wasn't without its challenges, because even as she began to redefine herself, the environment around her still reflected the life she once envisioned. Other households, other children, other versions of the future she had imagined for herself. And that contrast can be difficult to navigate, because it requires balancing two realities, accepting your own path, while still being part of a world that looks very different. Another important aspect of this phase was how it affected her relationship with Kody Brown. As Meri began to focus more on her own identity, the dynamic between them continued to shift, less defined by shared plans, more influenced by individual journeys. And while that change brought a sense of independence, it also highlighted the emotional distance that had developed over time. But perhaps the most important part of this chapter is what it represents. Because it's not just about Meri finding a new role, it's about her recognizing that her value isn't limited to one aspect of her life, that her identity isn't defined solely by motherhood, or by the expectations placed on her within the family, that she has the ability to grow, to evolve, to redefine what fulfillment looks like. And that realization is powerful, because it transforms the narrative, from one of loss to one of rediscovery. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how Meri's journey toward independence began to impact her relationships with the other wives, and how those dynamics continue to evolve as each person moved in a different direction. Because when one person changes, it often changes everything around them. As Meri Brown continued redefining her identity, the impact of that transformation didn't stay limited to her personal journey. It began to ripple through the entire family dynamic on Sister Wives. Because in a plural family, no one's experience exists in isolation. Every shift, every change, every new direction affects everyone else in some way. And for Meri, stepping into a more independent version of herself naturally began to change how she related to the other wives. In the earlier years, there had been a sense of shared purpose, raising children, managing households, building a life together. Even with differences and challenges, there was a common thread connecting them. But as time passed, and especially after Meri's fertility journey reached its turning point, that shared foundation began to evolve. For Janelle Brown, the relationship with Meri had always been complex. There were periods of cooperation, moments of distance, differences in personality and communication styles. And as both women grew more independent, those differences became more noticeable. Not necessarily in a confrontational way, but in a quiet understanding that their paths were no longer closely aligned.
Janelle was focused on her own priorities, her own lifestyle, her own version of independence. And while there was still respect, the connection didn't carry the same closeness it might have in earlier years. With Christine Brown, the dynamic also shifted significantly. Christine's eventual decision to leave the family marked a major turning point, not just for her relationship with Kody Brown, but for the entire family structure. For Meri, this created a new perspective, because Christine's choice represented something bold, a willingness to step away completely and build a new life. And while Meri's path looked different, it still influenced how she viewed her own situation. It showed that change was possible, that independence could take many forms, and that staying connected to the family didn't have to look the same for everyone. Then there's Robyn Brown. Her relationship with Meri has often been one of the more supportive ones within the family. At times, there seemed to be a sense of understanding between them, a willingness to communicate, to connect, especially during moments when Meri felt more isolated. But even that relationship wasn't immune to change, because as Meri continued to grow into her independence, the dynamics naturally evolved. Support remained, but the nature of that support shifted. Less about shared experiences, more about individual journeys. And that's something that happens in many relationships over time. They don't necessarily end, but they change shape. What makes this phase particularly important is how it reflects the broader transformation of the Brown family. Because the family that once functioned as a tightly connected unit was becoming something different. More individual, more separate, more focused on personal paths rather than collective ones. And within that shift, Meri's journey became a key part of the overall story, because her experience highlighted something essential, that identity and belonging are not fixed. They evolve, they adapt, they respond to the realities of life. For viewers of Sister Wives, this evolution was both subtle and powerful. It wasn't always marked by dramatic moments, but by small changes, conversations that felt different, interactions that carried a new tone, a growing sense that the family was no longer operating in the same way. At the same time, this shift also brought new challenges, because independence, while empowering, can also feel isolated, especially when it changes long-standing relationships. For Meri, finding balance became essential. Balancing connection with independence, balancing past relationships with present realities, balancing who she had been with who she was becoming. And that's not an easy process. It requires self-awareness, patience, and a willingness to accept that not everything will stay the same. But perhaps the most important takeaway from this chapter is that change doesn't always mean loss. Sometimes it means growth. It means creating space for new experiences, new perspectives, new ways of relating to the people around you. And for Meri Brown, this phase marked a significant step in that direction, a move toward understanding herself not just in relation to others, but as her own person. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how Meri's growing independence began to shape her relationship with Kody even further, and what it revealed about where they both stood in their connection moving forward. Because when individual paths become stronger, shared relationships are often tested in new and unexpected ways.
As Meri Brown continued growing into her independence, one relationship made the shift impossible to ignore: her connection with Kody Brown. Because while other dynamics in the family were evolving, this was the relationship at the core of everything. And over time, it became clear that something had changed in a way that couldn't be easily repaired. On Sister Wives, viewers began to notice the difference, not through one single moment, but through a pattern. Less emotional connection, less shared direction, fewer signs of the partnership that once defined their relationship. And while relationships naturally evolve, this felt like something deeper, a gradual distancing that had been building for years. For Meri, this distance wasn't just about communication, it was about connection, the kind of connection that goes beyond conversation, the feeling of being seen, understood, valued in a way that feels mutual. And as that feeling became less consistent, it created a quiet but powerful shift in how she experienced the relationship. One of the most difficult aspects of this change was how subtle it was at first. There wasn't always a clear moment where everything changed. Instead, it happened in small ways: missed opportunities to connect, conversations that felt surface level, moments where emotional support didn't fully meet the need. And over time, those small moments added up. For Kody Brown, the situation looked different, because his life, his responsibilities, and his relationships were spread across multiple households. His focus was divided, his time was limited, and as the family structure changed, those divisions became more pronounced. But even with those factors, the emotional gap between him and Meri became increasingly noticeable, not just to them, but to viewers as well. There were moments where the distance felt almost unspoken, where both of them seemed aware of it but unsure how to address it. And that's often one of the hardest places for a relationship to be, because without clear communication, it's easy for assumptions to take over.
for feelings to go unexpressed, for distance to become the new normal. For Meri, this raised an important question. What does this relationship mean now? Not what it used to be, not what it was supposed to be, but what it actually is in the present. And answering that question requires honesty, not just with the other person, but with yourself. Because sometimes holding on to a relationship means redefining it, and other times it means recognizing that it no longer serves the same role in your life. This is where her journey became even more complex, because unlike a traditional relationship, this wasn't just about two people. It was part of a larger family structure, a shared history, a public narrative on sister wives, and that makes every decision feel bigger, more layered, more significant. At the same time, Meri's growing independence began to shift the balance. As she focused more on herself, her needs, and her personal growth, she became less dependent on the relationship for her sense of identity. And while that can be empowering, it can also highlight the gaps that were previously easier to ignore. Because when you become more grounded in yourself, you start to see your relationships more clearly, what they offer, what they lack, and what they require to continue. For viewers, this phase of the story was both emotional and revealing, because it showed a side of the relationship that went beyond surface-level interactions. It revealed the complexity of staying connected when paths begin to diverge, the difficulty of maintaining a bond when the foundation has shifted, and the reality that not all relationships evolve in the same direction. One of the most telling aspects of this dynamic was the absence of resolution. There wasn't a clear turning point, no single conversation that changed everything. Instead, there was a gradual acceptance, a recognition that things were different, and that those differences might not be easily resolved. For Meri Brown, this acceptance didn't come with immediate clarity. It came with reflection, with moments of questioning, with the ongoing process of understanding what she wanted moving forward. And that process is rarely linear. It involves uncertainty, reevaluation, and the willingness to sit with discomfort. But it also opens the door to something important: choice, the ability to decide what comes next, what to hold on to, what to let go of, and how to move forward in a way that aligns with who you are now, not who you were in the past. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how Meri began to step more fully into that sense of choice, and how her path forward started to take shape beyond the relationship that once defined so much of her life. Because sometimes the most powerful shift isn't what happens within a relationship, it's what happens when you begin to move beyond it. By this point in her journey, Meri Brown was no longer just reacting to her circumstances. She was beginning to actively shape her future. And that shift, while subtle at first, marked one of the most powerful turning points in her story on Sister Wives. Because there's a big difference between enduring change and choosing it. For years, much of Meri's life had been defined by the structure of the family: shared goals, shared expectations, a shared vision of what the future would look like. But as those structures began to shift, and as her relationship with Kody Brown continued to evolve, she found herself with something she hadn't fully embraced before: space. Space to think, space to grow, space to decide what she wanted her life to look like moving forward. And with that space came a new sense of independence. Not forced, not sudden, but intentional. One of the first ways this independence showed up was in how she began to prioritize herself, her time, her energy, her goals. Instead of waiting for clarity from others, she started creating it for herself. And that's a powerful shift, because it moves you from a position of uncertainty into one of control. For Meri, this didn't mean completely stepping away from the family. It meant redefining how she participated in it, on her own terms, without relying on it as the sole source of her identity. This is where her personal growth became more visible. She began exploring opportunities outside the traditional family structure, focusing on her interests, her passions, her independence. And while those steps may seem small individually, together they created momentum, a sense that her life was expanding in a new direction. For viewers of Sister Wives, this phase was both inspiring and emotional, because it showed a version of Meri that wasn't defined by struggle, but by strength, not just enduring difficult circumstances, but rising beyond them. At the same time, stepping into independence doesn't mean leaving everything behind with emotion. There's still connection, still history, still moments where the past feels present. And for Meri, balancing that connection with her new sense of self was an ongoing process, especially when it came to her relationship with Kody Brown, because even as she became more independent, that relationship still existed, still carried meaning, still required navigation. But now the dynamic had shifted. Instead of defining her, it became just one part of her life, not the center. And that change brought clarity. Clarity about what she needed, what she expected, what she was willing to accept moving forward. Another important aspect of this phase was confidence, because independence often leads to a stronger sense of self, a clearer understanding of your value, your boundaries, your direction. And for Meri, that confidence began to show in how she carried herself, how she spoke, how she approached decisions. It wasn't about proving anything to others. It was about being secure in who she was becoming. Of course, growth doesn't happen without challenges. There were still moments of doubt, moments where the past resurfaced, moments where the path forward didn't feel entirely clear. But the difference now was how she handled those moments. Instead of feeling stuck, she moved through them, with awareness, with intention, with a growing sense of trust in herself. And that's what makes this chapter so significant. Because it's not just about independence, it's about ownership. Taking ownership of your story, your choices, your future, even when that future looks different from what you once imagined. For many viewers, this part of Meri's journey is one of the most relatable, because it reflects something universal, the process of rediscovering yourself after a major life shift, letting go of expectations, rebuilding your identity, and stepping into a version of yourself that feels authentic, even if it's unfamiliar. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how this independence began to influence how others saw Meri, and how her transformation started to change the way her story was perceived by fans and those around her. Because when you change how you see yourself, the world often starts to see you differently too.
As Meri Brown stepped more fully into her independence, something interesting began to happen, not just within her own life, but in how others perceived her journey on Sister Wives. Because transformation isn't only personal, it's also visible. And when someone begins to change in meaningful ways, the people around them, and the audience watching, start to see them differently. For years, Meri had often been viewed through a very specific lens, as the first wife, as someone navigating emotional challenges, as a person whose storyline was often tied to struggle, whether it was her relationship with Kody Brown or her fertility journey. And while those aspects were real, they didn't define the entirety of who she was. But over time, that's how many people came to see her, through the lens of hardship, through moments of vulnerability, through the parts of her story that were the most visible. Now, that perception was beginning to shift. As Meri embraced independence, confidence, and self-direction, fans started noticing a different side of her, a stronger presence, a clearer voice, a sense of self that didn't rely on validation from others. And that change didn't go unnoticed. For some viewers, this transformation was inspiring. They saw growth, resilience, the ability to move forward after years of emotional challenges. They admired her willingness to redefine her life on her own terms, to step into something new, even when it meant leaving behind familiar structures. But for others, the shift raised questions. Because when someone changes, it can challenge the expectations people have built around them. Some viewers wondered whether this new version of Meri was a response to past struggles. Others questioned how genuine the change was, not out of criticism, but out of curiosity. Because growth, especially when it happens publicly, often invites interpretation. And in a show like Sister Wives, where personal lives are shared with a wide audience, those interpretations become part of the narrative. Within the family itself, the shift in perception also had an impact. As Meri became more independent, her role within the group naturally evolved. She was no longer seen solely in relation to her past challenges. She was becoming someone who made her own choices, who followed her own path, and that can change how relationships function. Because when one person grows, it often requires others to adjust their understanding of that person. For Kody Brown, this shift may have been particularly noticeable, because the dynamic between them had long been shaped by shared history and evolving distance. But now, Meri was approaching the relationship from a different place, a place of independence rather than expectation, and that changes the energy of any connection. For Robin Brown, who had often been seen as one of the more supportive figures in Meri's life, the transformation also introduced a new dynamic. Support was still there, but the context had changed. Meri was no longer in the same position of emotional vulnerability. She was stronger, more self-assured, and that can shift even the most well-meaning relationships into something new. What makes this phase so compelling is how it highlights a universal truth. People don't stay the same, and when they change, the way they are seen changes too. Sometimes for the better, sometimes in ways that take time to fully understand, but always in ways that reflect growth. For viewers, this created a new layer of engagement, because instead of watching someone navigate struggle, they were now watching someone navigate transformation. And that's a different kind of story, one that's less about what happened to someone and more about what they choose to do next. Of course, perception isn't everything. What matters most is how Meri sees herself. But there's no denying that external perception plays a role, especially in a public setting. It influences conversations, it shapes narratives, it adds context to the journey. And in this case, it marked a clear turning point, from being seen as someone defined by limitations to someone defined by growth. As we move into the final part, we'll bring everything together,
looking at what Meri's fertility journey ultimately represents and why her story continues to resonate with so many people. Because in the end, this isn't just about one person's experience. It's about what that experience teaches us all. After everything Meri Brown has experienced on Sister Wives, the hope, the heartbreak, the difficult decisions, and the journey toward independence, we arrive at something deeper than just a storyline. We arrive at meaning. Because her fertility struggle was never just about having more children. It became a turning point that reshaped how she saw herself, her relationships, and her future. And in that process, it revealed lessons that go far beyond one person's experience. One of the most important lessons is this: not everything in life goes according to plan. No matter how much you want something, no matter how clearly you can picture it, there are moments where reality takes a different direction. And in those moments, the real challenge isn't just dealing with what didn't happen, it's deciding who you become because of it. For Meri, that meant facing a reality she didn't choose, a path that looked different from what she had imagined for years. But instead of allowing that reality to define her in a limiting way, she gradually began to redefine herself within it. And that's a powerful shift, because it transforms loss into growth. Another important lesson is the idea of identity beyond expectation. For a long time, Meri's role in the family was closely tied to motherhood and the idea of expansion. And when that part of her life didn't unfold the way she hoped, it forced her to ask a difficult question: who am I without this? That question doesn't have an easy answer, but it's also where real growth begins, because it pushes you to explore parts of yourself that may have been overlooked, to find value in areas that aren't defined by external expectations, to build a sense of self that comes from within, not from what you're supposed to be, but from who you truly are. Her journey also highlights the complexity of relationships, especially her connection with Kody Brown, because when one person goes through a deeply personal struggle, it inevitably affects the relationship around it. Sometimes it brings people closer, sometimes it creates distance, and sometimes it does a little bit of both. In Meri's case, it revealed the challenges of navigating something that wasn't equally experienced, the emotional gap that can form when two people are living different realities, even within the same relationship. And that's something many people can relate to, even outside of this specific situation. Another lesson is about acceptance, not the kind that comes easily, but the kind that develops over time, through reflection, through emotion, through the gradual understanding that holding on to what could have been doesn't always serve the life you're living now. For Meri, acceptance didn't mean forgetting her dreams. It meant honoring them, and then allowing herself to move forward, to create new goals, new meaning, new direction. And that's where her story becomes especially impactful, because it shows that endings are not always final in the way we expect. Sometimes they are transitions, shifts into something new, something different, but still meaningful. For viewers of Sister Wives, this journey resonates on a deeply human level, because while not everyone shares the same circumstances, many people understand what it feels like to face unexpected challenges, to let go of plans, to rebuild, to rediscover who they are in the process. And that's what makes this story so powerful. It's not just about infertility, it's about resilience, it's about growth, it's about the ability to move forward, even when the path isn't the one you originally chose. As Meri Brown continues her journey, her story stands as a reminder that life doesn't have to follow a perfect plan to be meaningful, that identity isn't fixed, that purpose can evolve, and that sometimes the most important transformations come from the moments we never expected. In the end, her journey isn't defined by what she couldn't have, but by what she chose to become, and that is what makes her story truly unforgettable.